Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, a warm welcome to all of you to the webinar series hosted by Advocates Association Bengaluru. This evening, we have with us today a distinguished jurist and a senior advocate, Mr. Sonde Koppa Sundar Swami Naganand. Sir, we are grateful to have you with us today, sir. I extend a warm welcome to you on behalf of Advocates Association Bangalore. With immense pleasure, I would now introduce you, sir, to our audience who already knew you very well. Mr. Naganand hails from a family of lawyers. In 1977, he obtained his basic degree from St. Joseph's College of Commerce. Later, he passed his LLB with 3 gold medals from Renukacharya College in the year 1980. And same year, he qualified as a chartered accountant with national merit rank to his credit. He obtained a diploma in French language and civilization from Alliance franchise at Bangalore. In 1981, he started to practice as a chartered accountant and later in the year started his legal practice in his father's chamber. He was designated as a senior advocate by the High Court of Karnataka in 2003. Mr. Naganand regularly appears in Supreme Court of India, international arbitrations and other high courts in the country. His areas of practice includes constitutional law, arbitration, infrastructure law, intellectual property law, company law, and taxation law. He is currently the Vice President of the Bar Association of India. He was the President of the Karnataka section of the International Commission of Jurists. He is a trustee of Vedanta Bharathi, which publishes many books on Hindu philosophy, and Samskrita Bharathi, which propagates spoken Sanskrit. Mr. Naganand is fluent in 9 languages and he has authored 2 books. One is a commentary on Adi Shankaracharya's Prashnottara Ratnamalika and the second one on Viveka Deepini. Mr. Naganand was conferred with a special honor as a living legend in law by the Bar Association of India. Once again, thank you so much, sir, for accepting our invitation. Over to you, sir. Sir, you are again muted. You will have to unmute, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, we are not able to hear you.
Sir, we are not able to hear you. You're muted.
Yes.
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 Right. Thank you, Trivikram, and good evening and my greetings to the Adhyaksharu of the Bangalore Advocates Association, Sri Ranganath, and the distinguished audience who I see in front of me and many who are not in front of me. I first congratulate the Advocates Association and its president and office bearers for this interesting initiative that has been. It's a very, very welcome initiative, and I think it's necessary for us to keep abreast of what is happening. And one way of doing it is to stay connected and to talk about law. Initially, I was thinking of another topic, but Trivikram suggested to me that many of them have heard this judgment called Keshavananda Bharathi. It is something like a mantra, and we have kept on hearing it. So just like mantras, when we keep hearing mantras, we don't think about the meaning. So that happened now in the profession. And therefore, I thought that I will see Keshavananda Bharathi judgment. So I think I've decided that we'll go ahead with that judgment. I'll give you some statistical information and then go to the facts of the case. I believe that you cannot understand the legal nuances and the until you have appreciated the fact in which the case is arisen. And but in the case of constitutional litigation, the factual matrix is often very limited. The person who comes before the court challenges the validity of a statute. And when that is done, what falls for consideration is mainly law, and the factual matter is not so important. But incidentally, you should know how the litigation arose. But before I go to that, I would say this is a a seminal decision of the Supreme Court. It's reported in 1973, 4 Supreme Court cases, 225. And the judgment is by a bench of 13 judges, by far the largest bench strength that we have had in the Supreme Court. Till recent, another relating to tax laws handled by a similar number of judges. But now the question is whether a larger bench must still hear this and consider it. One of the issues is still before them that in due course will come. But the interesting part is, out of the 13 judges, the total number of printed pages of this judgment, including the head note in the SEC volume, into 811 pages. I mean, that's a stupendous number by any standards. And one of the honorable judges in the judgment writes, Justice Jagannath Reddy, that the total number of days that this case was actually heard ran into 66 days. So I think you must appreciate the enormous task before the court. It raised a number of interesting points. The main issue why this went before a bench of 13 judges is because of an earlier judgment in Golaknath's case, which was of a smaller bench strength, where the question arose whether a constitutional amendment which affects the fundamental right in Article 13 of the Constitution, would such an amendment be permissible? And if it is done, would it be legally valid? That is a question which arose in Golaknath's case. And the Golaknath's case took the view that such an amendment would be unconstitutional, and such an amendment is not contemplated by the scope of Article 368 of the Constitution. So really speaking, Golaknath was the main reason why this matter went before this larger bench. The bench strength had the Chief Justice of India, Justice Sikri, presiding. I will give you in all, the number of judgments that are there. There is one judgment, the head note runs into 105 pages. The Chief Justice's judgment, which is a remarkable judgment in terms of content, prose, and crispness, is by Chief Justice Sikri, 104 pages. Justice Shelath and Grover wrote another 57 pages. Justice Hegde and Mukherjee wrote 49 pages. Justice Reddy wrote 60 pages. Justice Beg, Justice Matthew, and Justice Khanna wrote around 60 pages. Justice Ray, later Chief Justice, wrote 88 pages. Justice Dwivedi wrote a similar number of pages. And the junior most judge in the bench was Chief Justice Chandrachud, who later became Chief Justice. He also wrote about 80 pages. Now, if you analyze this judgment, I think it's high time that the Supreme Court thought about the system that we have in the United States Supreme Court, where the court usually delivers one judgment. And if somebody is not concurring, he writes a dissenting judgment, and all of them comes together. Now, in this judgment, there's been an elaborate discussion, and each judge has summarized his conclusion or their conclusion, if there's for two judges. And the court itself has summarized the entire conclusions and then sent the matter back to the respective constitution benches to take a final decision on the facts of each of the cases that were before them. Now, the main issue arose at the instance of a Matha or a Swamiji, Keshavananda Bharathi, who challenged the constitutional amendments which took away certain rights relating to land by means of amendments made to the Constitution by the 25th and the 29th Constitution Amendment Bills. Now, the decision arose in the context of, see, by these two enactments, what they did was that by the 25th Amendment, Article 31 was amended, And this was on account of the decision of the Supreme Court upholding the R.C. Cooper's judgment, where the bank nationalization was upheld. Now, a consequence of what was stated in that this was the reason why this amendment was made. Now, they substituted the word amount for compensation. And the question was, if property is taken away and some amount is stipulated in the law, is that justiciable? Is that valid? Is it taking away of the right to property? That was one issue that arose. The second, in the 25th Amendment, a new Article 31C was introduced. And in the 29th Amendment, the 9th schedule to the Constitution was amended, and certain entries were included in it. And the effect of those entries was that action taken thereunder was not open to challenge on the ground of violation of fundamental rights. So the main challenge was that by illegally exercising power to amend the Constitution under Article 368, in effect, what has been achieved is that Parliament has taken away certain fundamental rights that were available to citizens. This was the main thrust of the challenge. Now, to understand this, it is important for us to understand and see what exactly is the provision in Article 368 of the Constitution. Now, if you see Article 368, it's a very simple amending provision. By the Constitution 24th Amendment, the Article 368 was substantially amended. Now, in Golaknath's case, the law was before amendment, and in Keshavananda Bharathi case, what fell for consideration is the amended form of Article 368. If I can just read the relevant portions and not read all of it. It says, notwithstanding so and so, Parliament may exercise, in exercise of its constituent power, amend by way of addition, variation, or repeal any provision of this Constitution in accordance with the procedure laid down in this article. Then it says how it is to be done, and if some article is amended, what should happen, etc. Then nothing in Article 13 shall apply to any amendment made under this article. This was an introduction by the 24th Constitution Amendment. Now, in the course of argument, the court notes that the validity of the 24th Amendment is not questioned, in the sense that everybody accepts that the substitution of Article 368 by these changes, that itself is not illegal. So they proceed on the basis that the article as amended by the 24th Constitution Amendment is legally valid, and further, whether the action of amending certain portions of the Constitution in exercise of Article 368 power, is that legally valid? Is it in consonance with the Constitution? That is what fell for consideration. Just to recall, what does Article 13 provide? Article 13 says, I'll just read the relevant portions only. All laws in force in the territory of India immediately before the commencement of the Constitution, insofar as they are inconsistent with the provisions of this part, shall be void to the extent of inconsistency. So if you had a law prior to Constitution, that would apply. Then next, the state shall not make any law which takes away or abridges the rights conferred by this part, and any law made in contravention of this clause shall to the extent of the contravention be void. And as all of us are aware, Article 13 is coming in Part 3 of the Constitution, which contains the Fundamental Rights chapter. Part 4 is the Directive Principles of State Policy, and Part 3 is the Fundamental Rights. Now the question why they put Article 13 here is because 13.2 says that if you make any law which abridges means to reduce it or to reduce the ambit of it or the scope of it, then even to that extent, the law will be void. So they didn't want that to happen. Therefore, they put in this clause that any amendment made, Article 13 is not applicable. In other words, if an amendment takes away certain rights, which are guaranteed by Part 3 of the Constitution, merely by virtue of that, the amendment will not get invalidated. It will still be valid. This is the scope of the power that is there. Now, stalwarts in the bar addressed Mr. Palkhiwala leading arguments, Mr. Nirende, Mr. Sirvai. These are the people who are on the other side. Daftari, and of course, a host of other eminent counsel appeared. And as I already mentioned, 66 days it took for this judgment, for the hearing of these cases. Now, if you look at the four basic issues that fell for consideration, one is Article 368. What is the scope of that power? To what extent can that be amended? Second aspect that arose was, is there any constitutional basis for interpretation of the Constitution? And is it different while the court is interpreting any other law? Is it the same principles? Do we do it in the same fashion? That is another important principle that arose. That is, interpretation of the Constitution, whether that should be in accordance with the principles that are normally accepted for all other legislations. And third one, parliamentary sovereignty. See, in England, even now, Parliament is sovereign and the judiciary cannot strike down any law made by Parliament on the ground of violation of any fundamental rights. They don't call it fundamental rights there. They call it their Bill of Rights, which was incorporated in the Magna Carta. And as all of us are aware, England, the United Kingdom, does not have a written constitution except for Magna Carta and the rights that were given in 1500 something was Magna Carta. But so the principle there is Parliament is sovereign and court, because it is representatives of the people, and courts cannot strike down legislation. So this aspect also came up. One of the defenses, I'll come to that a little later, was that Parliament is supreme in the sense that the members of Parliament are elected by the public, the people, the citizens, and therefore the law made by Parliament is in effect the law made by the citizens. So that citizens are supreme. Therefore, how can the court strike it down? That was one of the arguments, which is met with elaborate discussion. And of course, that argument is negative. I'll come to that. And the last work was, what is the framework that one should have for working a nation? Our constitution is the basic document on the basis of which the aspirations of the people and the entire country is based on. So you are not meddling with some small instrument, you are meddling with the very history, the background, and the very existence of the country. And a lot of interesting discussion takes place in the course of the judgments about drastic amendments that may be made, a revolution that may come about, because if everything is done by a majority party, in fact that is also discussed in dealing with these four aspects. I am now giving you, these are the four major aspects that arose for consideration. Certain other important aspects also arose for consideration, because this judgment is of the year 1973. One of the issues that came for serious consideration, the Constitution of India, it has a preamble. We the people of India, and it goes on. Give unto ourselves sovereign, so the republic, etc. Now, does the court have to take note of the preamble in the interpretation of the Constitution? Is the main question. And one of the issues what we debated was the preamble is like just an expression of desire or hope. That is not part of the Constitution. Therefore there should be really nothing taken the preamble to the Constitution. The same argument that has been addressed. Because the preamble simply is we are hoping for this. Can that be changed? As part of the Constitution is one issue that arose for consideration. And all the honorables that delivered the judgment, as I just mentioned, address this aspect. And the court comes to a very interesting.
Sir, I'm very sorry to interrupt you, sir. The voice is echoing and we are not able to hear. It's echoing and there's a lot of disturbance. I'm sorry.
What should I do? As I can read the computer. Can you hear me now?
We are able to hear you, sir, but there's a lot of echo and there's a lot of disturbance behind the voice.
Okay, just a second, I can say it, might make it different. Just one second, I have a headphone.
Is that better?
Yes, sir.
Much better?
Yes. Please go ahead, sir. Sorry about it. Sorry to
Oh,
interrupt.
no, it's okay. So what I was mentioning was that the second aspect was in the constitutional interpretation, what is the role of the preamble? And all the honorable judges have gone into it in some great detail, and they come to the conclusion that the preamble is very much part and parcel of the constitution. The preamble, in fact, they say, is something like a pointer to the constitution. It is showing to the world and to the citizens as to what is it that our country is desiring and hoping for. And therefore, the preamble, though it is not in terms of Article 1, 2, 3, it is very much a part and parcel of the constitution. Now, incidental to this, one other issue on interpretation of statutes also had come up and it was examined. This marginal notes that are there in the interpretation of any statute. When we take a law, there will be a heading to the section. There will also be a note in the margin. What is the utility of these two? The traditional view has been that these marginal notes and the headings of the section are not relevant for the interpretation of the section. You must go to the actual wording that is used in the statute. That was the traditional thinking. But over a period of time, all over the world in every jurisdiction, courts have had to grapple with this, and they have come to the conclusion that these marginal notes and headings have some indicative reasons as to why it is there, and it will be very useful to refer to them. And therefore, in the same manner, preamble also has some great significance, is what the ruling was. Incidental to this again, but since I'm talking of interpretation of statutes, I've mentioned that. One other argument that was canvassed was, we need to see why this amendment was made, why this 24th Constitution Amendment was introduced, what were the object of the earlier Article 368, and this can only be found by looking at the Constituent Assembly debates as the original article stood, and the debates in Parliament when this 24th Amendment was introduced. This was the submission made. The other side opposed it by saying, no, what the ministers say in Parliament and what discussion takes place in Parliament is not so relevant. And therefore, those need not be looked into by the court. And whatever the minister might have said, it is not going to be of any use in interpretation of the words which are in statute. The court examined that and elaborately discussed the principles that are followed in various Commonwealth jurisdictions and also America, and came to the conclusion that it is very mildly stated that strictly whether that will be relevant or not is not to be seen, but they do indicate something. And they looked into the debates in Parliament and in the Constituent Assembly to understand the meaning and object of why this amendment was made to Article 368. So one more principle settled. Preamble is important. Marginal notes are important. Heading to sections are important. These are three things that came out of the ultimate decision that had to be made on the scope of Article 368. The next very important discussion that takes place is there is a distinction in the Parliament, in the Constitution. Part 3 talks of fundamental rights. Part 4 talks of directive principles of state policy. There's a lot of debate, and the debate was that while Part 3 is sacrosanct, Part 4 is equally sacrosanct, and even that can't be amended. Now, a lot of debate takes place, and the judges noticed In fact, in one of the judgments, they notice that Sri B.N. Rao, who was the draftsman and the main person who was piloting this bill, tried his level best to make both Part 3 and Part 4 justiciable. And finally, Parliament did not agree. And Parliament said, no, no, no. Part 3 is fundamental rights. Part 4 is a policy that should be followed. And a very interesting illustration is given by Justice Beg when he says that these two are like the path of the river and the river itself. He says the river itself is fundamental right, and the two banks of the river, they are the directive principles of state policy. In other words, they go along with each other, but in terms of enforcement, it is not so. Now, the reason why this debate arose was to what extent the directive principles of state policy are enforceable and can be sought and achieved through a court order or a issue of mandamus. And also in the examination of the validity, is there any distinction between the two? And the court clearly examines this and comes to the conclusion that directive principles of state policy are not justiciable, they are not fundamental in that sense, and no one has a vested right to ensure that that should be done. But the obligation is on the state to ensure that it does keep in mind the rights that are referred to in the fundamental, in the directive principles of state in Part 4 of the Constitution. The next aspect is the main thrust of the case, Article 368, scope. Now, a elaborate discussion takes place on the question of what is the meaning of amendment. What is amendment? And Justice Sikri very elaborately discusses this and says that an amendment simply means, and for that he relies on the golden rule, as we call it in interpretation, the golden rule being that you go by the express words used in a statute. There is no need to look at anything else. When the terms, the words of the statute are very clear, there is no need to go for any interpretation. And he says that amendment simply means that you change something which is in the statute. So when Article 368 is talking of amendment, it talks of amendment of the Constitution itself, and therefore there seems to be no ambiguity possible that when Article 368 enables amendment and the procedure is prescribed, that amendment could extend to every part of the Constitution, and you cannot really say that it applies to some aspects, it doesn't apply to some aspects. As I mentioned, in Golaknath's case, the issue that arose there was the court came to the conclusion that because the amendment was violating Article 13(2), because it took away some rights which were vested, the court came to the conclusion that that amendment was illegal. Now, initially in these judgments, a part of this Keshavananda Bharathi judgment, there are two views that are expressed. There is some doubt that is expressed, especially by Justice Khanna. And finally, the conclusion that they reach is that Golaknath's case is wrongly decided. In fact, in the final conclusion that the court draws at page 811, which is a joint conclusion of all the judges in the majority, they come to the conclusion that Golaknath was wrongly decided, though some of the judgments, including Justice Sikri, says that that is not necessary for us to so declare it, but the conclusion they reach in that manner. The reason why I'm mentioning this is that if the power to amend the Constitution under Article 368, the defense that was urged was that Article 368 will enable the state to amend every part of the Constitution. The petitioner's contention was, no, it is not so. It can only amend those parts of the Constitution other than fundamental rights. So there was a big debate about it. Is there any meaning? Is there any substance in this contention? And the court comes to the conclusion after a very elaborate discussion that if the procedure is followed, then such an amendment is permissible even to the fundamental rights. Later on they develop, because in the course of the judgments, you will notice number of illustrations are given which the judges will refer to, and I will refer to a few of them. So Parliament is no doubt supreme, but parliamentary rights are to be restricted, and the marginal notes. And one more document, one more very important principle that we find here is, there is the principle of contemporaneo exposito, or contemporaneous exposition of any law. For example, just after a law is made, there is some correspondence between government and some agency or authority, where government is explaining this is how it should be done. Very often in tax statutes, we find it. As soon as an amendment is made, a circular is issued explaining the scope and object of this amendment and why it is intended. These are called contemporaneous expositions. These are relevant and important. That is one of the issues, one of the points that arose on the interpretation of the constituents. Now, one other argument which has taken considerable number of pages is whether Article 368, is it an independent provision or is it part and parcel of the Constitution? You can amend the rest of the Constitution, but you cannot amend Article 368 itself. In considering this argument, there is very interesting illustrations that are given, and that is noticed by the court. They say, supposing a party in majority, there they refer to Congress party also, because that is a party which was in majority most of the time. The Congress party, if it is holding more than 2/3 majority in parliament, if they decide to amend the Constitution and take away fundamental rights of persons. Supposing they say we'll abolish parliament. It will be the president of the Congress party will become the president of the country for the lifetime. Supposing, then what happens? Now, the reason why they consider this is, while the power to amend is no doubt there, but there should be some checks and balances. And what is the check and balance? The argument was, why do you want to put check and balance? There is no provision in the Constitution for that. Otherwise, in Article 368, they would have provided that you can't amend this basic structure, this, that. You see, I'm now reminded of the this judicial colloquium, collegium, which has been created by the Constitution, by the Supreme Court. The language in the Constitution is very clear. It talks of the appointment by the executive, by the president. But they have now introduced this concept of a collegium. That is judgment by interpreting. Same way, by interpretation of Article 368, they have now introduced a concept, and that concept is one of basic structure. I'll come to basic structure shortly. Then I mentioned about this parliamentary supremacy. In that context, this example is what they have given. You'll find it in page number 653, para number 653, which is the judgment of Justice Hegde, where he refers to this about the brute majority which a party may have. What is the effect of an amendment which they may do to entirely abrogate the Constitution? If they do that, then what happens? And for that reason, the argument that after all, the members of parliament are elected by people, therefore they have a right to represent the people. Therefore, what they decide is the will of the people, is the argument. They say, no, no, we can't take it like that. They're elected for a limited purpose of governing the country. It doesn't mean that all the rights of the citizen, his fundamental right, because the international, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted on 10th December 1948 by the United Nations General Assembly, which makes certain human rights inalienable. And that declaration is taken note of by the Indian Constituent Assembly while framing our constitutional rights, fundamental rights chapter. There is a reference to this in Chief Justice Sikri's judgment also. When that is the basis, these are inalienable rights. You cannot have the state to say, I can execute anybody. That such a right is not available to them. Why? If they say your fundamental right under Article 21 is now abrogated, so you don't have a right to life, they can't say that. So this parliamentary supremacy argument is dealt with in this manner and very beautifully and succinctly analyzed. Now, Article 13.2, I've already referred to it. Now, to what extent will the amendment under Article 368, if they do it, to what extent can it impinge on fundamental rights? Now, Justice Khanna, surprisingly, in para number 1377, deals with this issue and comes to the conclusion that fundamental rights can also be amended by means of a parliamentary amendment under section 368, because that was the main issue which arose in Golaknath's case. Golaknath's case, they said it can't be done, but Justice Khanna reaches this conclusion that it is possible, and the same conclusion is reached by Justice Sikri and 3 other judgments also. So that is the majority view. Now, while reaching this conclusion, Justice Hegde and Justice Mukherjee very beautifully analyze this, and they say, while you can abridge some rights, you cannot completely annihilate the rights. You can say that, for example, now we have preventive detention law. You have a freedom. That freedom is curtailed by an order made in terms of a preventive detention legislation. So to that extent, your fundamental right of freedom of movement is curtailed, but that is circumscribed by certain safeguards. So your rights are abridged. So they add a rider now. That is how this theory of basic structure develops. There can be abridgment of rights, but there can't be complete annihilation of rights, is what they say. Now, the other argument is there any limitation on the power to amend, or is there no limitation at all? You can amend to what extent, whatever extent you want. That is where in a beautiful passage in para number 292 of Chief Justice Sikri's judgment, he beautifully analyzes it. I'll try to just read that one portion. It's a very, very small para. Para 287, for the aforesaid reasons, I am driven to the conclusion that the expression amendment of this constitution in Article 368 means any addition or change in any of the provisions of the constitution within the broad contours of the preamble and the constitution to carry out the objectives in the preamble and the directive principles. Beautifully put. Applied to fundamental rights, it would mean that fundamental rights cannot be abrogated. Reasonable abridgment of fundamental rights can be effected in public interest. So that is where they start with discussion. This is the concluding part of his thing, where they start the discussion by taking these extreme examples and come to the conclusion that there are some basic structures. And if you see what are these basic structures, that is also analyzed. The basic structures, you will find it in para 292 of the judgment. These are the basic structures of the Constitution. 1, supremacy of the Constitution. 2, the republican and democratic form of government. 3, the secular character of the Constitution. 4, the separation of powers between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. And 5, the federal character of the Constitution. These are the basic structures or the foundation. And as things have developed, now many other aspects have come after this judgment. For example, in recent times, there was a judgment of the Supreme Court, which Justice Chalimesh was speaking for the bench, noticed in a matter that large number of tribunals are constituted, which are adjudicating disputes between parties. Those tribunals don't have any judicial member. And there is neither a district judge, nor a lawyer, nor anybody with legal qualification. And they have now taken a view that such is impermissible. And to the extent that is so, they have struck down those legislations. And I said it is important for you to introduce this concept of a judicial member in all quasi-judicial tribunals. Now, the argument there was that the basic structure of the Constitution requires that executive and the judiciary are independent of each other. So if you're going to have only retired government officers sitting on tribunals, what is going to happen? So at least there must be a semblance of impartiality. This is one aspect. The second aspect is this tribunalization of justice. Now, many tribunals are constituted, and the argument arose in L. Chandrakumar's case many years ago, as to whether these constitutions, tribunals are legally valid, and whether the power exercised by the High Court can be given to these tribunals, and can they exercise such powers. That is also a matter of extreme debate. And Article 323 tribunals, protection, all that was discussed in that. Even that is a precursor. Now again, I think we've come full circle, where what is this basic structure has been used in many times now. For example, this in basic structure argument now, we have got a judgment of the Madras High Court, which discussed this question relating to appointment to the company law board by non-judicial members being there. And the same thing happened in the national, before the Supreme Court, National Tax Appellate Authority. There also the court came to the conclusion that no, it can't be done. And lastly and most importantly, many legislations contain a provision which says that any action taken under this will not be challenged before any court. Now on that, there are a number of judgments which have taken the view that in the separation of powers, the court's power cannot be abrogated, especially the High Court power. Whatever law you may provide, alternate remedy, this, that, whatever it is. But you can't provide that. High Court cannot exercise power under 226 and 227. It is now held to be a basic structure. So why I'm mentioning this is that these are the essential parameters of the basic structure. And also one more argument was there that, this power to amend, the section itself talks about amendment. So where is the need for you to go and look into any other principle like implied power, explicit power and all that? It's not necessary. In that context, I was mentioning to you, supposing the constitution is abrogated and repealed by a majority of parliament, what happens? There's no constitution in existence. Even 368 will go, the constitution will also go. This is an extreme example that is given to say that the basic structure is now formulated. You can only change some doors, some windows, some vastu corrections and all that you can make, but you can't demolish the building and then say there is no house at all. So what protection? Somebody says, I have protection of a house, and you can only change some small things, but you can't change the entire nature of the structure. That is what is the meaning of this. Then Justice Sikri develops this basic structure in paragraph number 292 and 395, or if you people want to read it a little bit more. And now is where all the judges concur, and they come to the conclusion that Article 368 is itself a basic structure. So in other words, if you are going to amend the basic structure, then that amendment must also be in consonance with fundamental rights and with the preamble to the constitution and the constitutional philosophy. If supposing you say they amend Article 368 and say the Prime Minister may amend the constitution in the manner that he deems fit. Supposing they introduce such an amendment. And today what we are seeing is everybody will stand up and do Sashtanga Namaskara and approve that resolution. At least in Parliament, that's what will happen. Now, if that is done, would that be contrary to the basic structure of democracy? That is where they are cautioned to say that 368 itself is basic structure. Then next point that they have examined is, supposing a law is made, supposing an amendment is made, to what extent will that amendment be outside the purview of judicial review? And they lay down beautifully that judicial review is a basic structure of the constitution. Whatever legislation you may make, if the challenge is before the competent constitutional court, that court has the authority to examine this and take a decision whether that is valid or not valid. I've already referred to 24th Amendment because that changed the nature of this Article 368. The 25th Amendment related to these two aspects which gave rise for this controversy. And the 29th Amendment is the one which related to this aspect. I would now like to conclude by reading the conclusions of the judgment. This is what the final paragraph reads. The view by the majority in these writ petitions are as follows. Golaknath case overruled. Article 368 does not enable Parliament to alter the basic structure or framework of the Constitution. The Constitution 24th Amendment is valid. Section 2A, 2B of the Constitution 25th Amendment is valid. The first part of Section 3 of the Constitution 25th Amendment is valid. The second part, namely, that no law containing a declaration that it is for giving effect to such policy shall be called in question in any court on the ground that it does not give effect to such policy is invalid. In other words, they sustained judicial review, though the law was upheld. The Constitution 29th Amendment Act is valid. That is the one by adding items to Section 31C. The Constitution bench will now determine the validity of the 26th Amendment in accordance with law. Cases are remitted to the Constitution bench. So I think this seminal judgment, which has elaborately discussed many of these concepts and lays down, I think it's now been more than 30 years nearly since this judgment has come, and it has held the field, and maybe in due course of time, I think 30 years is a long time, though it's a short time in the life of a nation, but nevertheless, it is a sufficiently long time to apply the principle of stare decisis. There has been a very elaborate discussion. In fact, there is a very recent American Supreme Court judgment. I will, pass it on to Trivikram for passing on to everybody else. It's a very recent judgment, which is relating to the question whether, of course, this is digressing from the topic, but since we have come there, I'll just mention it and stop there. In many of the states in America, they have a provision for a jury trial. Now, this case arose in relation to a jury trial case, and the US Supreme Court had to examine one aspect relating to the jury trial and the constitutional validity of how it is done. And the US Supreme Court dealt with it in a very, very elaborate judgment where this principle of stare decisis is examined there. And there's a very illuminating discussion on that aspect. I think for people who are interested in some academic enrichment, that would be a good judgment to read. It's a very well read judgment. And also you will see the powerful language that is used in the judgment against each others. There is majority judgment, what it says against the minority, and the minority, what it says against the majority, and why they are differing from an earlier judgment. It's a very well written judgment. So that's how the law develops. I think I've come to the end of what I wanted to say. If there's some questions, I'm willing to take it. Thank you.
Session. It was wonderful. It was a brilliant experience. Before we go to the question and answer session, we have one of the stalwart advocates, Mr. B.V. Acharya, who is a participant today. So if I request Praveen to unmute, sir. So if sir could address us,
sure.
that would be great. Praveen, please
unmute
I have unmuted. Acharya, sir.
Yes. Sir also should, yeah.
Hello.
Sir, please, sir, I request you to address our participants today, sir.
No. You are hearing now?
Yes, sir.
Are
We are
you
able to hear
hearing me?
you, sir. Yes, sir.
Oh, see, I feel as if I am sitting in a division bench along with S Naganand. Therefore, as a junior judge, I would like to only say I fully agree with what he has said. I may add that there is a principle that any decision rendered will not be interfered with if it has been in force for a long time. He referred to it.
We are humbled, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir.
No. One point I want to say, judgment is of 1973. Therefore, as on today, it is in force for the last 47 years, not 30 years, as Mr. Naganand has been saying. This judgment is in force for the last 47 years.
Absolutely, sir. That's true.
Okay.
Once again, I thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Very much, Mr. Acharya. I'm humbled by your comments. I am your Shishya, sir. I can't be your senior judge. You have signed my sanad also. So how can you say that? My namaskar.
No. I thought you are both a chartered accountant and a senior counsel. You can't. This is a small arithmetical mistake between
I know.
73 and 2020. But one thing that I want to point out, this judgment, that the final conclusion is signed by only 8 judges. There is some controversy about it, whether what has been called out as the ratio is really the ratio if you read all the judgments together, or is the opinion of only some of the judges who have signed it. Because as you might know, Mr. Sudesh Pai has got his own view in the matter, and I hope you have also read the book by Mr. Anyarjuna, how this ratio is brought about.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you for the nice exposition. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. So coming back to the session, learned members, your Q&A box is now active. You can shoot your questions on the box, or Praveen requests you to unmute all the lines. So
Yeah, I've unmuted already.
directly questions online.
Yes, it is unmuted now.
Request you to shoot your questions. You can put forth the question before the next speaker.
Can I speak?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
S Naganand, good evening. I'm Rangarajan here.
I can see you.
How are you? Long time. S Naganand.
Hey, sir.
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
My question is very, very simple. Now, our country is beyond 70-year-old. Basic education, basic health care, basic insurance for health care, I don't think are fundamental rights. And by means of resorting to Chapter 4 of the Constitution, are these rights enforceable constitutionally is my question.
I would like to answer it in this fashion.
Please.
Yeah. The distinction between fundamental right and directive principles of state policy are quite well delineated. But what is happening today is that in the guise of saying that these are the fundamental rights of these poorer sections of the society, the right to life.
Attendance ಇದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಬರ್ತದಲ್ಲ ಅದು.
Sir, I'm sorry, you're muted, sir.
ಇಲ್ಲ ಅದು ಅವ್ರದ್ದು ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಇದೆ.
I request all the learned members to maintain silence.
Yeah, what I was saying was that when the right to life is questioned, that is how courts are entertaining. Because he has no food, he has no shelter, he has no medical treatment. Court is now stepping into the picture to see what can be done. So it's not that courts are enforcing the directive principles of state policy. Court is looking to see whether the fundamental right of these citizens who are not before the court, can something be done to protect them? That's how the courts are looking at it.
So you feel they could also be enforced? Healthcare, education?
Yes, to the extent that, hunger, for example, 1 meal a day, something should be done. There should not be deaths by hunger. So to that extent, yes. But where do you draw the line? Because the state also doesn't have these facilities today. Where do you draw the line? That's the difficulty now.
Thank you, Naganand. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any more questions?
Yes, sir. Shall I speak?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Sir, this is question. There's a conflict between a judiciary and executive. There will be a conflict always. So in future also. So if till the collegium exists, so the basic structure will survive. Once the collegium may goes out. So what about the basic structure? Because they already tried to remove the appointment of the judges, that is collegium, by National Judicial Appointment Commissions, and they are trying to introduce All India Judicial Services like that one. So once the collegium goes, probably the basic structure will also goes with the collegium. So what's your opinion, sir?
I think the question is slightly outside the purview of today's topic, but quickly I can mention. You see, the creation of the collegium itself is something which is not there in the constitution.
Yes, sir.
So therefore, if they introduced a legislation to constitute a National Judicial Commission, which is there in many democratic countries and it is working completely well. Why it should not work in our country, I don't know. But anyway, that legislation met with a fate and they have not introduced anything more now. And the judiciary itself chickened out. And the second constitution bench matter was before them. They had to frame the guideline for this collegium. They didn't do it. And they said, government will prepare a framework and place it before us, then we'll consider it. And they never took the decision. So ultimately, I think, the balance has to be maintained. And as of now, the collegium system is working.
Right.
Sir, once again, any more questions? Allied members?
Please have.
Yes, sir.
Please may have. I am from Dharwad.
Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Good evening,
Mr.
sir.
Pramod.
I am Angre from. I'm from Dharwad, practicing advocate.
Yes.
Just I want to know only one thing in Keshavananda Bharathi's case. According to me, the main question was whether amending power of the by the legislators under Article 368. Now, whether the amendment is there any limitation on it, that was another question. But ultimately, out of 13 judges, the lordship, full bench, 6 judges were of the opinion that amending power, they cannot take away the fundamental rights or totally amend the constitution. Another 6 of their lordship, they said, yes, they can do it. Then the question of, then their lordship Justice Khanna said, amending power is to any extent can be done, but it should not take away the basic structure theory. So that means 6 and 6 on either side, and only neutral judge Justice Khanna was there who said amending, it can amend the constitution, but not to the extent of taking away the basic structure theory. Now, ultimately, what would be the decision of the majority judges, a majority judgment?
That's the reason why I read the conclusion, which is signed by 9 judges, I think, where they summarize their conclusions. You see, the report, the printed law report, mentions the judgments delivered by each of these judges or in twos or single. The concluding session, that is the conclusions of the judgment, that is drawn up by the majority judgments who have, majority of them have signed it. That's what the report shows. So in other words, you go by the operative portion. I think the distinction is this. You see, in Golaknath's case, there is an absolute law that you cannot amend the fundamental rights at all.
Please.
Now, in this judgment, they say as an absolute proposition that is not acceptable. Therefore, to that extent, we say the Golaknath is wrong, absolute proposition. But we are saying now that you can amend, but it should be in consonance with the basic structure, fundamental rights, preamble, take all these into consideration and then give effect to the amendment. That is what they have now said. So in a particular case, supposing some amendment is done, let us say an amendment is brought about which says any lawyer above the age of 60 years cannot practice in court, supposing they bring in such a legislation. Now you and me will be directly affected. So we cannot go to court. So if we go to challenge this legislation on the ground that they didn't have power to amend because practicing profession is my fundamental right. Article 19 gives that power.
Please.
So if you then challenge it, they will say, no, we have power. If Golaknath case stood there, then this amendment would have to go only on that ground because they had no right to amend. But now the law is, yes, they had right to amend. But what is the basic structure? Does this amendment change the basic structure? Or is it unreasonable? Both these counts. See, any reasonable restriction on profession is valid.
Valid.
So, therefore, to that extent, if they make such a law, absolutely anybody above 60 cannot practice, then maybe it will be struck down on the ground that the restriction is too onerous and too drastic. Yes.
Impermissible,
the
as
restriction is too drastic to that extent.
Please.
So that's the distinction. I hope I clarified it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Do we have any more questions? Anybody there? I repeat, any more questions? Can we conclude?
Excuse me, sir. I have a question, if I may.
Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead.
So first of all, I'd like to thank you for the session. It was very informative. So the main question I have, okay, so in my opinion, the basic structure doctrine acts as a safety valve to democracy. And as you rightly said, it's a part of the whole checks and balance system. But in the present day, in my opinion, I feel like for the basic structure doctrine to work effectively, there has to be judicial accountability. It's not that I don't have any faith in the judiciary. I have faith in the judiciary, but then we also had 4 judges come out in 2018, and they spoke about some of, about corruption in the judiciary. And it's not, well, I'm not really sure how we can increase judicial accountability while maintaining judicial independence in the view of making sure that the basic structure doctrine works effectively. I hope you've understood my question.
Yeah, I think the point that you're raising is, well, it's one thing to say that an amendment should conform to the basic structure doctrine, but when a challenge arises, who is going to decide it? How will they decide it? How independent will they be? Now, fortunately, in our judicial system, the system itself has checks and balances. You have a single judge, you have a division bench, then you have a Supreme Court. Now, these are checks and balances. So to expect that in a particular case, consistently throughout, all the judges are compromised, nobody will decide it impartially. I think we are not in such a despondent state today, in our judiciary at least. We have occasions where many judges are extremely independent, extremely erudite, very hardworking, and they are rendering justice. Every day we are seeing what is happening. Therefore,
I agree, sir.
This general feeling that people speak, I mean, as lawyers, I think we should be a little careful about, joining this kind of discussion, because some lay person will say, "Ayyo, avrige enri duddu ella tagondu order madibidtare." And this kind of comments we keep on hearing, I distance myself from that. We should do that. We should tell them, look here, don't make such comments. If you are aggrieved by a wrong order passed by a judge, there is a full remedy available to you. Go to appeal, go to Supreme Court. Don't simply, criticize. In fact, Mr. Nariman, I remember many years ago, he addressed the bar in Bangalore. And one advice he gave to the young lawyers, he said, see, we are all part of the system. So for heaven's sake, I'm advising you, whenever you lose a case, don't ever go and tell your client that the opposite side paid money to the judge and therefore you lost your case. You have to tell your client, look here, I did my best. The judge passed an order which he thinks is right. If we think that order is wrong, then we have to challenge it in an appropriate proceeding. There is a better judge who's going to hear it in an appellate forum. I will try to convince him. This is what you should tell your client. rather than turning around and saying ಇವರೆಲ್ಲ ಈಗೇನೆ ಲಾಯರ್ ಜಡ್ಜಸ್ ಏನು ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗಲ್ಲ ದುಡ್ಡು ತಿಂದ್ಬಿಡ್ತಾರೆ. That's the caution which I would give to young lawyers. Otherwise, the system is working. There are always aberrations, you know.
Yes,
Everybody's intelligence is not the same. I know of many very, very, what shall I say, absolutely impartial judges, but they write incorrect order. What can you do? I mean, it's a system error that there's some order which is made, which you can point out. That's why you are there. That is why appellate court is there. Your capacity to point out to the appellate court that to this extent, this conclusion drawn by the judge is not in accordance with facts or law. That's what we should endeavor to do. So I think we should not be despondent. Our judiciary is quite good and the judges are working extremely hard. And I have to salute them for the work that they're doing.
I agree. So it's important to ensure that public faith is restored in the system. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Do we have any more questions? I think we have just come to the fag end of this session, sir. You are much indebted. Amid your busy schedule, you have accepted, you have agreed for the session. On my personal behalf and on behalf of Advocates Association Bangalore, I thank you, so thank you, sir.
It gave me an occasion to reread the judgment, which I had read in my college days.
College days.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. With your permission, I'm just logging off the session, sir.
Thank you to Mr. Acharya and all the colleagues who are on.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Namaskaram.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
It was excellent, sir.
Thank you.
It was for all the judges and advocates.
Thank
I too agree that what Nariman said, we should not blame the judges or the opposite
Thank you.
parties.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
We'll be ending the call now. Thank you.
Namaste, sir.